It's a journey that has many markers. We're born. We learn to walk. We ride a bike. We go to school. We get a car. We graduate school. We may go on to a job.
Literature-loving friends, welcome back. Before I dive in, let me remind you gently to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and keep that bell icon close. Because what I'm about to share with you is not just a review, it is a journey into shadow and silence, a meditation dressed as a thriller, a work that pulses with grief as much as with gunfire. Wrath of Man 2021 is not the kind of story that washes over you lightly. It sits inside you like a wound, like a bruise pressed too long, demanding attention. And for me, stepping into it felt less like consuming entertainment and more like encountering an elegy wrapped in the skin of a revenge tale. From the very first frame, I felt a stillness, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of waiting. The armored truck loomed on the screen like a beast of metal, trundling through the Los Angeles streets, carry within it not just money but the invisible weight of danger. I was immediately reminded of crime novels where settings themselves breathe with tension, Dashiell Hammett's alleys, James Ellroy's freeways, Chandler's rain-slicked boulevards. This wasn't just Los Angeles. It was Los Angeles seen to the eyes of inevitability, every corner pregnant with threat, every pause heavy with the promise of rupture. And then, when violence erupted, it wasn't flashy or decorative. It was sudden, brutal, almost surgical. A reminder that in this world, power doesn't announce itself with speeches. It arrives with the crack of gunfire and the shudder fear. And then came Jason Statham, entering not with flamboyance, but with the kind of restrained presence that makes you lean forward instinctively. His character, introduced simply as H, unsettled me from the moment he appeared. He wasn't trying to charm us. He wasn't even trying to explain himself. He simply stood there, taciturn, unreadable, a man carved from silence. In a way, I thought of the old archetypes from Western literature. The nameless gunslinger walking into town, the stranger who reveals himself not with words but with deeds. Yet here, instead of dusty plains and saloon doors, the battleground is armored trucks and city streets. The weapons are machine guns and pistols. The duels are robberies and ambushes. And yet the archetype remains, inevitability wearing the mask of man. What fascinated me in these early scenes was how the film refused to hurry. It didn't rush into explanations, didn't hand us backstory on a platter. Instead, it let ambiguity fester. Who was this man really? What did he want? Why did he move with such terrifying precision? We were shown just enough to trust his skills, but not enough to understand his motives. That withholding was deliberate. It reminded me of novels where the narrator dangles a secret, forcing you to read deeper, to search for what is not said. Cinema here became literature's cousin, storytelling through absence as much as presence. The atmosphere itself was a character. The armored truck depot, with its blend of banality and danger, hummed with unease. These were working men, ordinary on the surface, but every drive out onto the streets carried the possibility of ambush. It struck me how cleverly the film used setting as metaphor. These trucks, these routes, this industry. It was all about transporting wealth, protecting money, symbols of power and greed, and yet within them rode fragility, mortality, silence. To watch Statham's character assume this role was to watch someone step into machinery of capitalism only to expose its underbelly of violence. And then, literature-loving friends, came the fracture, the reveal of violence not as accident, but as echo of something deeper. The robbery that sets the story in motion, the death that scars a protagonist's life, is not just a plot device. It is wound origin, curse. When we finally glimpse the truth, that this man's stoicism masks a grief carved by the murder of his son, suddenly everything tilts. Every silence becomes grief unsaid. Every act of precision becomes vengeance rehearsed. What we thought was detachment is, in fact, obsession. And in that moment, the story becomes tragedy. We are not watching professional at work. We are watching a father broken beyond repair, a man who has emptied himself of everything but fury. I thought then of classical tragedy, of characters who carry inevitability inside them. H is not unlike Orestes or Hamlet. Figures who cannot step away from vengeance because vengeance has become their very definition. And yet, unlike those figures who spill words in endless soliloquies, H remains nearly silent. His grief does not spill out. It calcifies. He doesn't speak philosophy. He enacts it. That silence unsettled me more than speeches ever could. It reminded me of the power of minimalism in literature, the way Hemingway left wounds unsaid, the way Beckett used silence as weight. Here, Statham's face became the text, his eyes the punctuation. The first half of the film toys with us structurally, looping back, showing events from multiple angles. At first, I found it disorienting, but soon I realized it was deliberate. The film was teaching us how to see. Memory itself is fractured, grief itself is recursive, and truth is never linear. To understand this man, we had to see not once but again and again, each time from a new angle, each time revealing a layer we had missed. The technique struck me as literary, Faulknerian, even in its insistence that truth must be pieced together, not given. As I watched the armored truck crews banter, betray, bond, I felt a kind of bitter irony. These were men who spoke of loyalty, who joked in break rooms, who carried guns of bravado, but beneath their camaraderie ran fear. And H, sitting among them, seemed always apart, always colder, always calculating. His interactions reminded me of Shakespeare's tragic figures, who sit among men but stand apart in purpose. He wasn't there to belong. He was there to hunt. And every moment of false laughter, every seemingly casual exchange, trembled with the knowledge that his purpose was darker, heavier. And then, the robberies themselves, staged with Guy Ritchie's precision, hit me not just as action but as ritual. Each ambush, each firefight, was not spectacle but sacrifice. Men fell not for wealth alone, but for the inevitability of violence that shadows greed. The way the film captured these sequences, with tight framing, sudden eruptions, lingering shots of aftermath, reminded me of how literature sometimes pauses not on action, but on consequence. Blood on asphalt, silence after chaos. These became the true punctuation marks of the story. The revelation of H's past, his role in the criminal underworld, his connections, his son's murder, shifted everything. Suddenly, the armored trucks, the robberies, the gangs, became backdrop to something far more intimate. This was not a story of money. It was a story of grief weaponized. And grief, when weaponized, becomes the most terrifying force of all. I remember sitting in the theater, realizing that I was not rooting for justice, not even for vengeance. I was simply watching inevitability march forward, as though the screen itself had surrendered to fatalism. And in that realization, literature-loving friends, I felt haunted, because I recognized in this story not only the drama of men with guns, but the universal truth of loss. We all carry grief. We all long for answers to wounds that cannot be mended. And though most of us will never enact vengeance with such brutality, we know the hollow silence that follows loss, the desperate need to assign blame, the fantasy of justice even when justice cannot restore. That, I think, is why this film lingers. It doesn't simply give us action. It gives us grief dressed in steel. By the end of the first act, I felt as though I had been pulled not into an action thriller, but into a morality tale, a myth staged in modern dress. The armored trucks became symbols of greed. The robbers became echoes of fate. H became the embodiment of wrath, silent, unstoppable, tragic. And I knew then that the story would not end with triumph but with devastation, because tragedies never give us happy endings. They give us truth, however bitter. So, literature-loving friends, the opening movement of Wrath of Man is not introduction in the casual sense. It is initiation into grief, silence, vengeance. It is the opening of a wound we will carry with the protagonist until the very end. And as I leaned back in my seat, the glow of the screen pressing into my eyes, I realized I was not watching entertainment. I was watching Myth Reborn, tragedy retold, inevitability dressed in Jason Statham silence. Literature-loving friends, as we move into the first half of the plot, I want to invite you to lean with me into the unfolding layers of Wrath of Man. What began in the introduction as silence, ambiguity, and wounded inevitability now deepens into something more structured, more deliberate, a slow march through deception, revelation, and rising inevitability. This first half of the story does not hurry. Instead, it coils and recoils, returning again and again to the same events, each time letting us glimpse another shard of truth. Like a fractured mirror, it forces us to piece together an image of who this man is and why he moves with such terrifying focus. We begin with the armored truck company itself, a world that feels both ordinary and perilous. Men clock in, trade banner, strap on holsters, sip bad coffee, and prepare for routines are anything but routine. The depot feels like a liminal space, half workplace, half war zone. The trucks may carry cash, but they also carry death, and everyone knows it. This setting grounds us in a grim realism. There is nothing glamorous about this world, only steel, asphalt, and suspicion. Into this atmosphere enters H, quiet, deliberate, choosing his words with economy that borders on menace. His new colleagues joke, prod, attempt to size him up, but he offers nothing. He seems to absorb their words like stone absorbs rain, without change, without trace. And immediately, we sense his apartness. The first half of the film is structured around this apartness. Scenes of camaraderie unfold. Drivers ribbing each other, mocking weaknesses, boasting of toughness. But H never quite joins in. He is there, but not there. His silence creates unease. His aura suggests not a rookie trying to fit in, but a predator waiting in disguise. And then, when the inevitable attack comes, his true nature flashes. Where others panic, he moves with precision. Where others fire wildly, he shoots with surgical accuracy. The robbers fall not as casualties of chaos, but as prey to a hunter who has been waiting. His colleagues stare in shock, realizing that the quiet man beside them is far more dangerous than they ever suspected. Yet the brilliance of this first half lies not only in what we see, but in what is withheld. We know he is skilled, but we do not yet know why. We know he moves with purpose, but we do not yet know what fuels him. The film teases us with flashbacks, fragments of past events. The robbery where his son was killed, the chaos of bullets, the shattering of family. But these glimpses are not given all at once. They come piecemeal, demanding that we reinterpret everything we thought we knew. Each reveal shifts our understanding, just as a novel might drip details through shifting narrators. The violence in this first half is striking not for its quantity, but for its weight. Gunfire is loud, sudden, final. There is no romanticization here. Death comes quickly, without flourish, and the camera lingers on aftermath. The silence after shots, the blood on steel, the heavy breathing of survivors. These choices remind us that this is not action for spectacle. It is violence as inevitability, grief as ritual. I thought often of Greek tragedy again. How death is not shocking but expected. How the weight lies not in the act itself but in its consequences. The structure of the first half continues looping. We are shown the same events from different angles. A robbery seen first as chaos, later as backstory, later still as revelation of betrayal. This fracturing builds suspense not through surprise alone, but through reconfiguration. Each time we return to the same moment, we see it differently. What was once background noise becomes crucial clue. What was once a nameless gunman becomes the face of the murderer. It is as if the film insists, truth is never given once. It must be revisited, reread, reseen. What also unfolds here are the rivalries within the armored truck company itself. Jealousies flare as H's competence overshadows veterans. Suspicion grows. Who is this man really, and why does he act with such uncanny calm? The tension inside the depot mirrors the tension outside on the streets. Even among supposed allies, distrust breeds. This layer fascinated me because it suggested that violence in this world is not only external, robbers versus guards, but internal, born of ego, envy, fear. The film insists that systems are always fracturing, that betrayal can come from both within and without. Through these layers, we see the protagonist's true motive begin to emerge. His son's death becomes the center of gravity, pulling every action toward it. This revelation reconfigures the entire narrative. H is not simply protecting money or doing a job. He is stalking vengeance. The armored trucks are not workplace, but battlefield. Each mission, each ambush, each skirmish is another step toward identifying the killers. Suddenly, every silence, every narrowed gaze, every measured shot takes on new meaning. This is not stoicism. It is obsession. What moved me most in the first half was the way grief simmered beneath the violence. There's a scene where H stands alone, silent, and the camera lingers on his face. No tears fall, no words are spoken, and yet the weight of loss presses visibly against him. I felt then that this was the true heart of the film. Not gunfire, not robberies, but a father's grief calcified into wrath. It is a grief so heavy it has burned away all softness, leaving only inevitability. The first half builds relentlessly toward confrontation. Suspicion rises. Robberies escalate. The circle of suspects narrows. The structure itself accelerates. Where early scenes lingered in silence, later ones snap with urgency. By the midpoint, we no longer question whether H will find his son's killers. We only wonder how much destruction he will unleash along the way. That inevitability presses down like fate itself, a drumbeat that grows louder with every passing scene. And so, literature-loving friends, the first half of Wrath of Man is not mere setup. It is initiation into tragedy. It loops, it fractures, it replays, demanding that we read and reread. It establishes grief as motive, wrath as inevitability, betrayal as constant. It immerses us in a world where armored trucks carry not only money but the weight of violence, where silence speaks louder than words, where a father's loss becomes a fuse that ignites everything. By the time we reach the midpoint, we know this story will not end in peace. We know we are inside a tragedy where inevitability has already been written, and we lean forward, bracing for the storm that must follow. Literature-loving friends, the second half of Wrath of Man tightens its grip like a vice. If the first half was a labyrinth of ambiguity, fractured timelines, and withheld motives, the second half is the march of inevitability. This is where grief becomes fully weaponized, where the mask of silence cracks just enough for us to see the raw wound beneath, and where every path converges toward violence that no one can escape. By this stage of the film, I no longer felt like a viewer sitting safely apart. I felt implicated, pulled into a cycle of vengeance that left no room for distance. The structure itself shifts in tone. In the first half, the film withheld information, looping back on itself, forcing us to piece together fragments. In the second half, the revelations have already been laid bare. We know who H truly is. We know what fuels him. We know the face of his grief. What remains is execution. The story becomes relentless, each scene ratcheting up the tension, each encounter carrying us closer to the inevitable clash between H and those responsible for his son's death. The ambiguity of the first half gives way to clarity, but this clarity is not relief. It is doom. We are drawn deeper into the lives of the robbers, the men who pulled off the ambush that shattered H's world. What struck me was how the film gave them dimension. They are not faceless villains. They are men with their own camaraderie, their own ambitions, their own fractures. By showing us their internal rivalries, their loyalties and betrayals, the film mirrored the armored truck company from the first half. Systems, whether lawful or criminal, are always unstable, always breeding betrayal. Watching their greed unravel them, I thought of Shakespeare's bandits, of Macbeth's thanes, of how ambition corrodes even the bonds of thieves. This mirroring reinforced the fatalistic weight of the story. In a world built on greed, no brotherhood endures. H's path of vengeance grows more brutal, more surgical. He interrogates, hunts, dismantles. His silence becomes even heavier, his actions more terrifying. The violence escalates not in spectacle but in precision. Each killing feels inevitable. Each interrogation, another stone laid in the path toward the final confrontation. I found myself almost dreading the climax, not because I didn't want him to succeed, but because I knew his success would not heal him. Vengeance, in tragedy, never restores. It only completes the circle of destruction. The film builds toward the climactic robbery with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. The robbers plan their grand heist, aiming to strike with precision and greed, but H is already moving toward them, drawn by fate as much as by will. Watching these parallel movements, I felt the weight of destiny pressing down. It reminded me of epics where armies march toward each other, where the outcome feels inevitable long before the clash occurs. The tension lay not in whether H would reach them, but in how many would fall before the final reckoning. The climactic robbery itself is staged with breathtaking intensity. The armored trucks roll out, the robbers strike, chaos erupts. Gunfire ricochets through steel corridors, money scatters like leaves in a storm, men fall in brutal, unglamorous death. And within this chaos moves H, silent, precise, inevitable. His presence turns a robbery into ritual, a stage upon which vengeance enacts itself. Watching it, I felt the violence not as spectacle but as inevitability, as if each bullet were a syllable in a poem already written. The editing, sharp and relentless, created a rhythm that felt almost liturgical, sacrifice enacted in steel and blood. The confrontation with the man who killed his son arrives like the final chord of a symphony. When H finally faces him, the silence is deafening. Words are few, but meaning is infinite. This is not catharsis in the Hollywood sense. This is catharsis in the tragic sense. The act of vengeance lands not as triumph, but as inevitability. H's wrath finds its target. But in the moment of completion, there is no joy, no release, only the heavy silence of inevitability fulfilled. I felt a chill then, because I realized the film had never promised healing. It had promised wrath. And wrath is always empty once enacted. The aftermath lingers not on triumph, but on loss. The grid of armored trucks, the gangs, the betrayals, all collapse into silence. H remains, but he is not restored. He is scarred, hollow, empty by the very vengeance that defined him. The story does not end with celebration, but with inevitability completed. It reminded me of how tragedies conclude not with resolution, but with echo, leaving us to sit in silence with the weight of what has transpired. As I leaned back, watching the final frames, I felt the film's second half press into me like a weight. It had shown me violence not as entertainment, but as elegy, vengeance not as justice, but as inevitability. Jason Statham's silence, his stoic presence, became in those final moments less a performance and more a philosophy. He embodied the truth that grief, when calcified into wrath, can move mountains, but it cannot heal the wound that birthed it. So, literature-loving friends, the second half of Wrath of Man delivers not release, but resonance. It abandons ambiguity for inevitability, shifting from puzzle to tragedy. It immerses us in violence that is precise, surgical, and inevitable, culminating in a confrontation that resolves the plot but leaves a wound unhealed. And in that unhealed silence lies the power of the story. For tragedies do not soothe us. They remind us of the weight of being human, of the inevitability of loss, of the futility of vengeance, of the silence that follows wrath. Literature-loving friends, now that the full shape of the story is unfolded, let us pause with the figures who carried it. Plot is movement, but characters are weight, the human anchors that make events matter. In Wrath of Man 2021, what struck me most was not only Jason Statham's taciturn protagonist, but the web of men around him, each one revealing some shard of humanity's contradictions. This is a story steeped in masculinity, loyalty, betrayal, and grief, and the characters embody those themes of a rawness that is both haunting and unforgettable. At the center is H, known in the world of the armored truck company as a quiet newcomer, but to us revealed slowly as a man hollowed by loss. Jason Statham plays him with restraint bordering on austerity. His performance is a study in minimalism. Clipped words, unreadable expressions, movement calculated with precision, and yet beneath the surface lies an ocean of grief. What fascinates me is how the film communicates that grief without ever letting him indulge in monologue or sentimentality. His face is silence, his precision and violence. These become the text we must read. H is less a man than a wound given form, a father whose son's murder calcifies him into inevitability. In literature, we would call him a tragic figure, a man driven not by ambition, but by absence. His humanity is defined by what he has lost, and his actions are the echo of that absence. His relationship with his son, glimpsed only in fragments, gives context to everything. In those brief flashbacks, we see tenderness, normalcy, the fragile beauty of everyday life, a father and son caught in the banal rhythms of existence, and then ripped apart by sudden violence. That ordinariness becomes unbearable memory. The character of the son, though not present for long, haunts the story like a ghost. His absence is the most powerful presence in the film. It is a reminder that in tragedy, the most important characters are sometimes the ones taken from us, because they leave behind silence that defines everything. The supporting cast of armored truck guards offers its own complexity. There are men who bond over jokes, men who boast of toughness, men who try to size up H and find themselves unnerved. Their banter feels authentic, lived in, yet beneath it simmers distrust. One guard, cocky and suspicious, becomes a foil to H, mocking him, probing for weakness. Yet with every display of H's precision, his bravado falters, revealing insecurity. This dynamic reminded me of how in literature, minor characters often serve to highlight facets of protagonists. The guard's arrogance makes H's calm more terrifying. His suspicion makes H's silence more enigmatic. The rivalries among the guards also reveal the fragility of systems built on greed and fear. Loyalty among them is conditional, trust brittle. H's presence exposes these fractures, widening them until camaraderie collapses into suspicion. These dynamics fascinated me because they revealed the film's worldview. Systems, whether lawful or criminal, are equally unstable, equally corrupted by ego. Characters here are not archetypes of good or evil. They are men shaped by desperation, ambition, envy. The robbers themselves are given surprising depth. They are not faceless villains, but a brotherhood of sorts, bonded by military background, bound together by greed, and yet fractured by ambition. We see their planning, their camaraderie, their bickering. One of them emerges as particularly chilling, the man who pulled the trigger that killed H's son. He carries himself with arrogance, a swagger born of violence, but beneath it lies insecurity. He is dangerous not because he is invincible, but because he is reckless, a man driven by impulse rather than inevitability. In him we see the antithesis of H. Where H is silence, he is noise. Where H is precision, he is chaos. Their collision was always fated, not only because of the murder, but because they embody opposing philosophies of violence. The leader of the robbers, more calculating, more disciplined, provides another contrast. He is the strategist, the one who seeks control where others chase thrill. Watching him, I thought of Machiavellian figures in literature, men who value order but are undone by the chaos within their ranks. His intelligence makes him formidable, but also blinds him to the unpredictability of grief. He can plan for greed, but he cannot plan for wrath. In the end, his failure to anticipate H reveals the limits of strategy when confronted with tragedy. Secondary figures, too, add texture. The manager of the armored truck company, with his blend of cynicism and bureaucracy, struck me as a symbol of institutional indifference. To him, men are replaceable, deaths are statistics, money is the only real concern. In his presence, I felt the cold machinery of capitalism pressing down, reminding us that systems care little for grief. His character may not dominate screen time, but he embodies a theme, that human lives are always secondary profit in such worlds. Even the minor guards, who fall in robberies or cower in fear, contribute to the sense of fragility. Their deaths are not glamorous. They are reminders that violence is indiscriminate, that in this world, anyone can fall. They are the chorus of tragedy, their fates echoing the inevitability of destruction. What strikes me most, literature-loving friends, is that every character in Wrath of Man seems defined by contradiction. H is both father and executioner, human, and myth. The robbers are both comrades and rivals, loyal and treacherous. The guards are both tough and fragile, boastful and afraid. This layering of contradiction makes them feel alive, more than archetypes, more than pieces on a board. They breathe with human frailty, and it is that frailty that makes the story resonate. And yet, in the end, All these characters orbit the gravity of H's grief. His silence refracts through them, shaping their arcs, defining their fates. He is the wound at the center of the web, and every other figure becomes a thread drawn into his inevitability. That, to me, is the essence of tragedy. One man's loss becomes the axis upon which all other lives turn, until the story collapses into silence. So, literature-loving friends, when I think of the characters of Wrath of Man, I do not see heroes and villains in the traditional sense. I see a chorus of flawed men, each carrying shadows of greed, grief, or ambition, each caught in systems larger than themselves. I see a father hollowed by loss, robbers undone by greed, colleagues fractured by suspicion. I see humanity stripped bare, contradictions illuminated in shadow and gunfire. And in that chorus, I see tragedy, unavoidable, unforgettable, echoing long after the credits fade. Literature-loving friends, every great film carries within it not only the grand sweep of narrative and the heaviness of theme, but also the peculiarities, the strange details, the odd textures, the little facts that cling to the mind long after the story has ended. These strangenesses are like fingerprints, unique marks that make a film alive in ways that are not always obvious. With Wrath of Man, 2021, I found myself haunted not only by Jason Statham's silence or the brutal choreography of its robberies, but also by the subtle quirks scattered through its architecture. These are not mistakes. They are deliberate or accidental gifts, the kind of details that make rewatching worthwhile, that whisper to us, look closer, because the world of this story is stranger than it first seems. The first strangeness that stayed with me was the very structure of the film. Most revenge thrillers unfold linearly. Loss, pursuit, confrontation, resolution. Wrath of Man refuses this order. It fractures time, loops back on itself, retells the same events from shifting angles. At first glance, this seems like simple narrative experimentation, but on reflection, it feels stranger, almost literary. The film does not want us to simply witness. It wants us to re-witness, to relive, to re-enter trauma again and again. This looping structure is itself a strange fact. It mirrors grief. Loss does not occur once. It recurs endlessly in memory, replayed in fragments, reframed with each recollection. The film's strange timeline is not gimmick, but embodiment of mourning. Another curious fact lies in its sound design. Pay close attention during quiet scenes, and you will hear subtle mechanical hums, faint drones that feel almost like the growl of the city itself. This is not just atmospheric filler. It unsettled me because it made me feel that Los Angeles in this story was alive, humming with menace. The strangeness of these background sounds reminded me of horror cinema, where silence is never truly silence, but always pregnant with threat. Here, too, the world breathes with unease, a strange detail that infects even mundane moments with dread. The geography of the film also struck me as peculiar. Los Angeles has been filmed countless times, but in Wrath of Man, it feels oddly abstract. The freeways, warehouses, and armored truck depots are stripped of glamour. Streets feel empty, devoid of life beyond the violence unfolding. It is as though the city itself has been hollowed out, reduced to a stage for grief and vengeance. This strangeness makes the setting feel less like realism and more like allegory. Los Angeles here is not a city. It is a battlefield, a mythic arena stripped of distraction. I realized then that this was part of the film's genius. It uses real locations but renders them uncanny, familiar yet hollow, reminding us that grief transforms even ordinary streets into landscapes of war. One of the strangest details I noticed was the way H moves through rooms. Watch him closely. He rarely rushes. Even in moments of chaos, his walk is steady, deliberate, unhurried. This is unusual for action cinema, where speed is equated with urgency. Here, stillness is equated with inevitability. The strangeness of his gait communicates volumes. He does not chase, he arrives. He does not scramble, he executes. It is almost supernatural, as though wrath itself cannot be hurried. This small physical choice by Jason Statham transforms ordinary scenes into unsettling rituals. The robbers themselves carry odd quirks worth noting. Their camaraderie, laced with military discipline, feels authentic, but the way they bicker reveals their fragility. At one point, their greed and arrogance almost tip into parody, as the film wants us to see that their downfall is written not only in bullets, but in their very personalities. Their strange combination of professionalism and recklessness makes them unnerving. Capable yet careless, brothers yet betrayers. It reminded me of strange facts in history, where great heists were undone not by law enforcement, but by arrogance and infighting. Another strangeness is the way the film lingers on money. Cash, piled and bundled, appears again and again, but always in ways that emphasize its coldness. It is never shown as wealth to be enjoyed, never associated with pleasure or luxury. It is simply mass, weight, paper, burden. This is strange in a genre that often romanticizes the spoils of robbery. Here, money is stripped of glamour, shown only as fuel for violence. Watching those stacks of bills, I felt nothing of desire, only dread. That reversal is peculiar and powerful. Wealth, the thing men kill for, is rendered meaningless, lifeless, even grotesque. There is also the strangeness of silence. In a film of guns and shouts, silence should feel like relief. Instead, silence here feels heavier than noise. When H stares without speaking, when rooms go still after gunfire, the silence grows unbearable. It becomes its own presence, louder than words. This strangeness unsettled me because it revealed the truth of grief. The absence of sound of life is more frightening than the presence of violence. I cannot ignore the strangeness of fate in this film. The very coincidence that H's son was killed in a robbery he narrowly escaped is both believable and mythic. It feels like cruel accident, but also like destiny. The film never explains it away. It simply lets us sit with the improbability, the almost absurd cruelty of it. This strangeness elevates the story from realism into tragedy. Because in tragedy, coincidence is never random. It is fate wearing the mask of accident. Even the way death is portrayed carries strangeness. Characters die abruptly, without ceremony, sometimes without even the dignity of music to accompany their fall. This bluntness is unusual in action films that often glorify death with slow motion or swelling soundtracks. Here, death is stripped, raw, abrupt. That strangeness unsettled me but also reminded me of life's reality. Death is rarely cinematic. It is sudden, jarring, unfinished. Perhaps the strangest fact of all is how cold the film feels. Most revenge stories encourage us to cheer, to feel satisfaction as wrongdoers fall. Wrath of Man denies us this. Its tone is icy, its victories hollow, its protagonist unredeemed. The strangeness lies in this refusal of catharsis. We do not leave the theater cleansed. We leave unsettled, haunted, even disturbed. It is strange because cinema so often promises release, but here it gives us only weight. And yet, that strangeness is what makes the film unforgettable. So, literature-loving friends, when I think of Wrath of Man, I think not only of Jason Statham's stoicism or Guy Ritchie's direction. I think of the strange fingerprints, the fractured structure that mirrors grief, the hum of the city alive with menace, the hollowed-out Los Angeles, the deliberate slowness of H's movements, the robber's contradictions, the cold stacks of money, the unbearable silence, the cruel coincidence of fate, the bluntness of death, and the icy refusal of catharsis. These are the peculiarities that elevate the film from mere thriller to mythic tragedy. They remind us that strangeness is not distraction, it is essence. For in strangeness, we glimpse the truth that ordinary order cannot reveal. Literature-loving friends, if the strangeness of Wrath of Man whispered us in odd details, then the critical perspectives roar like a chorus, reminding us that every story is more than itself, that every film is an argument, an allegory, a mirror of the world in which it was born. To me, the greatest pleasure of reflecting on this film lies not only in recounting what happened, but in sitting with what it means when seen through different lenses. Critical perspectives allow us to stretch the story beyond its armored trucks and gunfire, to see it as literature, as myth, as politics, as philosophy. And when I consider the major movie events in this film through those lenses, I find them transformed from action set pieces into meditations on grief, capitalism, violence, and fate. From a literary critical angle, Wrath of Man sits firmly in the tradition of tragedy. Its structure, built on loss, vengeance, and inevitability, echoes the Greek stage. H is a modern Orestes or Hamlet, a man defined not by choice but by wound. His grief becomes his destiny. His silence is mask. His wrath is only language. The murder of his son is not just backstory. It is a tragic flaw inflicted upon him by fate, a wound that propels him toward destruction. In this light, the robberies are not merely crimes but rituals, sacrificial events through which inevitability unfolds. When H finally enacts vengeance, it is not catharsis but confirmation of the tragic law. Wounds do not heal. They only complete their circle. From a mythological perspective, the film becomes a retelling of an ancient archetype, the father-turned-avenger. Across mythologies, we find similar figures. Heroes who descend into shadow not for glory, but for the reclamation of blood. In Norse myth, fathers seek vengeance for slain sons. In Homer, grief-stricken warriors destroy cities for their kin. H belongs to this lineage, not because the film quotes it explicitly, but because grief and wrath are universal myths, older than any nation or franchise. In this sense, the robbery that takes his son becomes his Trojan War, the battlefield upon which his personal Iliad is fought. A postmodern perspective highlights the fractured structure of the film by retelling events from multiple angles, showing the same robbery from different perspectives. Guy Ritchie echoes postmodern literature's obsession with subjectivity. Truth here is not singular. It is refracted, fragmented, endlessly reinterpreted. Critics who read the film this way might argue that it destabilizes the notion of linear justice. If events can be seen differently depending on perspective, then vengeance itself becomes unstable. Is H truly hero, or is he simply another criminal, his grief justifying atrocities? Postmodernism thrives on such ambiguity, and Wrath of Man participates fully in that game. Politically, the film can be read as critique of capitalism and militarism. The armored trucks symbolize wealth in transit, capital moving through streets, guarded not by justice but by men with guns. These trucks, more than any character, embody the system. Cold, heavy, faceless, demanding loyalty but offering no dignity. The men who drive them are cogs in the machine, replaceable, expendable. Meanwhile, the robbers are ex-soldiers, trained in violence by the state, abandoned after service, now turning their skills to crime. In this reading, Wrath of Man becomes a political tragedy. A system that commodifies wealth and discards soldiers creates the very violence it seeks to contain. H's vengeance, then, is not only personal. It is indictment of a world that manufactures its own chaos. From a psychological perspective, the film explores trauma and its distortions. H's silence, his stoicism, can be read as symptoms of post-traumatic grief. He is a man unable to process loss except through violence, a figure embodying Freud's concept of repetition compulsion, endlessly reenacting the scene of trauma, seeking mastery over it, but never achieving peace. The robberies replay his son's death, again and again, until he finally reaches the killer. Yet even then, he gains no healing, only emptiness. Psychologically, this is devastatingly accurate. Vengeance does not cure trauma, it reinscribes it. Looking at the major movie events through these perspectives, they take on new resonance. The opening robbery, which first appears as random violence, becomes a primal wound, the original sin upon which the narrative is built. Seen through tragedy, it is fate. Through politics, it is systemic collapse. Through psychology, it is trauma. The reveal of H's identity midway transforms the entire narrative. From one angle, it is the unmasking of a tragic hero. From another, it is the exposure of another criminal disguised as avenger. The climactic robbery, staged with brutal precision, becomes more than spectacle. It is in mythic terms the final battle. In political terms, the collapse of brotherhoods built on greed. In psychological terms, the repetition of trauma that finally breaks the cycle but leaves only emptiness. Even the small movie events invite critical reflection. The banter among guards in the depot, their fragile loyalties, their suspicions of H. These moments reveal masculinity in crisis, men clinging to bravado in a world that reduces them to cogs. Critics might read these scenes as commentary on toxic masculinity, the way men weaponize silence and mockery to mask fear. The flashbacks, showing H's criminal ties and his son's death, can be read as moral destabilization. He is not innocent, not hero, but another player in a violent system. The film refuses to let us rest in simple binaries, insisting instead that all men in this world are compromised, all caught in cycles larger than themselves. Audience reception, 2, forms part of the critical conversation. Some saw it as straightforward action, praising its grit and Statham's stoicism. Others felt disturbed, noting the coldness, the refusal of catharsis. Critics debated whether its fractured structure elevated it to literature or muddied it with confusion. For me, this divergence is telling. Great works always split audiences because they resist being one thing. Wrath of Man is both action thriller and tragedy, both genre piece and myth, both political critique and psychological portrait. Its events can be read at surface level as robberies and shootouts, or at deeper levels as meditations on grief, capitalism, and fate. So, literature-loving friends, when I consider Wrath of Man critically, I see a kaleidoscope. Through tragedy, it is myth reborn. Through postmodernism, it is fractured truth. Through politics, it is indictment of systems that breed violence. Through psychology, it is portrait of trauma without cure. And through all these, it is tragedy, a story that denies catharsis, that insists grief cannot be undone, that leaves us haunted in silence. The movie events are not just plot points. They are rituals in this tragedy, each one a station on the march of inevitability. Literature-loving friends, if watching Wrath of Man on screen felt like stepping into a bleak myth of vengeance, then learning about a production is like peeling back the curtain of that myth and discovering the sweat, improvisation, accidents, and artistry that made it possible. I've always been fascinated by how the behind-the-scenes world mirrors the story itself. For this film in particular, the act of making it carried its own atmosphere of grit, discipline, and quiet intensity, just like the story Guy Ritchie and Jason Statham were bringing to life. What we see as inevitability on screen was, behind the camera, the product of hundreds of fragile decisions, long days, and strange coincidences that gave the film its distinctive texture. One of the first production insights worth noting is that Wrath of Man is a remake, adapted from a 2004 French thriller called Le Convoi Cash Truck. Guy Ritchie, however, did not approach it as a simple retelling. He took the skeleton of the original, armored truck robberies, an Avenger in disguise, and restructured it through his own lens of fractured narrative, non-linear storytelling, and mythic fatalism. This adaptation process is itself fascinating. It meant re-engineering a European story of working-class desperation into a Los Angeles tale of capitalism, militarism, and grief. That act of cultural translation is a kind of behind-the-scenes alchemy, showing us how stories migrate across continents, morphing with each retelling. The choice of Jason Statham as the lead is another key production detail. This film marked a reunion between Ritchie and Statham after nearly 2 decades. Their careers began together with Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch, films bursting with humor, speed, and ensemble chaos. Returning here, their collaboration had matured, hardened. In interviews, Statham described the production as unusually restrained, with Ritchie stripping away his trademark humor and kinetic banter to make room for silence and menace. Statham himself said it felt strange, even uncomfortable, to suppress his natural screen charisma and instead embody an almost statuesque presence. That discomfort became part of the performance. His silence wasn't only in character, it was in process. Filming in Los Angeles and its outskirts created its own production strangeness. Ritchie and his team wanted to capture the city not as the glossy postcard Hollywood, but as an austere, hollowed-out stage for violence. Locations were chosen carefully. Wide industrial boulevards, anonymous warehouses, desolate freeways. Crew members spoke of how eerie the sets felt, especially the armored truck depots built for the shoot. Walking onto them was like stepping into a bunker, cold, metallic, humming with artificial light. That atmosphere seeped into the cast performances. Even when cameras weren't rolling, the environment weighed on them. One actor recalled how standing inside a truck set for hours, surrounded by steel and silence, made him feel like part of a coffin. The armored trucks themselves were more than props. They were production challenges. Heavy, unwieldy, claustrophobic. They demanded new camera rigs, inventive choreography, and patience. Some of the most gripping shootouts in the film took place in the confines of those trucks, which meant the crew had to squeeze cameras into impossible angles, often strapping rigs to ceilings or sliding them into footwells. Statham and other actors trained repeatedly inside the trucks, rehearsing not just lines but movements, how to load, aim, reload, duck, and brace inside such tight spaces. One stunt coordinator joked that it felt less like acting and more like learning how to live inside an armored coffin with a gun. Speaking of stunts, the production leaned heavily toward practical effects. While CGI enhanced certain sequences, much of the action, especially the robberies, the car chases, the shootouts, was staged with real vehicles, real squibs, real explosions. This decision gave the film its visceral authenticity. Actors recalled the adrenaline of standing amid practical pyrotechnics, of feeling the heat of detonations, of hearing real bullets crack through glass around them. Safely rigged, of course, but still frightening. The choice to prioritize practical effects mirrored the film's aesthetic. Raw, blunt, unglamorous. The violence feels weighty because, behind the scenes, it was weighty. The editing process was another crucial production layer. Ritchie and his editors structured the film in its fractured, looping style only after months of experimentation. Early cuts apparently played out more linearly, but test screenings left them flat. Ritchie then leaned into non-linear storytelling, reordering scenes, so that each robbery was reframed from new angles. This was risky. Some feared audiences would find it confusing. But Ritchie insisted that grief itself is not linear, and the editing had to mirror trauma's repetition. This behind-the-scenes decision explains why the film feels so different from typical thrillers. It was engineered in the editing room to function like memory, looping back on itself, haunting itself. There are also fun facts that lighten the intensity. On set, despite the grim story, the cast apparently joked often to break tension. Crew members recalled Statham's dry humor and how he would tease younger actors during downtime. One anecdote described him slipping into an armored truck during a break, pretending to guard the catering table like a money truck, refusing to let anyone in without a deposit. Even in darkness, humor found its way onto the set. These little stories remind us that filmmaking, for all its seriousness, is also play. Another curious production detail is how the military background of the robbers was shaped. Ritchie hired consultants with real combat experience to advise on tactics, formations, and dialogue. The actors playing the ex-soldiers trained together, running drills, learning how to move as a unit. This immersion gave their camaraderie authenticity. One actor later said he felt like he had joined platoon, not a film cast. That realism is why their scenes, especially the planning sequences, feel so convincing. Their brotherhood was forged not only in script but in training. The score, composed by Chris Benstead, carries its own behind-the-scenes story. Ritchie asked him to create something oppressive, almost funereal, a sound that would embody wrath itself. Benstead experimented with cellos, basses, and electronic distortion, layering tones until the score felt like a heavy hum in the chest. He described it as music you don't listen to, but feel pressing against you. That philosophy explains the unusual soundscape of the film. It is less melody than atmosphere, less tune than tension. The strangeness of the score is no accident. It was designed to suffocate, to remind us of grief's weight. Even the way Statham prepared for the role carries a behind-the-scenes fascination. He trained with firearms specialists to ensure his precision looked authentic. What surprised some was how little dialogue he had to memorize. Whole scenes depended on silence, on presence. He reportedly spent more time working on posture, stance, and stillness than on lines. For an actor known for quips and physicality, this role demanded subtraction rather than addition. That subtraction became the essence of H's menace. Finally, I can't help but note how the production itself mirrored the themes of the story. Just as the characters moved within systems of distrust and loyalty, so too did the crew navigate pressures of budget, scheduling, and pandemic restrictions. Just as the story fractures time, so too did the production fracture days into endless retakes, each angle reframing meaning. Just as H carried silence as his weapon, so too did the filmmakers embrace restraint, stripping away humor, glamour, and flourish until only cold inevitability remained. So, literature-loving friends, when I think of Wrath of Man behind the scenes, I see not just cameras and trucks, but echoes of the story itself. Silence shaping performance, grief shaping editing, discipline shaping camaraderie. I see accents of light turned into language, jokes hidden in darkness, stunts staged with grit, and a score designed to suffocate. In those production details and fun facts lies a second story, the story of how myth is built from sweat silence and strange coincidence. And knowing that deepens my appreciation, because it reminds me that even inevitability on screen is the product of fragile human collaboration. Literature-loving friends, the setting of Wrath of Man is not merely backdrop. It is a living, breathing participant in the story, a silent conspirator that shapes mood, underscores grief, and amplifies the inevitability of violence. When I reflect on this film, I find myself haunted not only by Jason Statham's silence or the brutality of the robberies, but by the landscapes that contain them. The depots, the freeways, the hollowed-out neighborhoods of Los Angeles, each stripped of glamour and rendered cold, almost skeletal. This is a city drained of excess color, a world where architecture itself seems to mourn. The armored truck depot is one of the most powerful elements of the setting. It is introduced to us as a workplace, a place where men clock in, where they sip coffee and tease each other. But the longer we sit with it, the more it becomes a bunker, a holding pen, an arena waiting for blood. The trucks themselves, lined like coffins in a row, hum with menace. They are not just vehicles. They are symbols of greed, of a system that values paper and steel over flesh and blood. Every time we returned to this setting, I felt the air thicken. The walls seemed to close in, reminding us that no man inside was safe, that the very job itself was a death sentence disguised as employment. Then there are the streets of Los Angeles, filmed not as a vibrant sprawl of sunlight and excess we know from postcards, but as hollow corridors of inevitability. The freeways stretch endlessly, drained of humanity, populated only by trucks and robbers, hunters and prey. Warehouses loom like fortresses, their emptiness amplifying the echoes of gunfire. Alleyways and underpasses become corridors of ambush. Even in daylight, the city feels shrouded. There are no vibrant billboards, no buzzing nightlife. Only steel, asphalt, and silence. It struck me how the cinematography stripped Los Angeles of its identity until it became allegory. This wasn't a city anymore. It was grief given architectural form. The visual palette contributes heavily to this effect. The film embraces muted colors, cold grays, harsh blacks, dull metallics. Even moments of brightness, sun glinting on trucks, headlights piercing night, feel harsh, almost cruel. This palette unsettled me because it rejected the glamour often associated with heist films. There is no glistening gold, no seductive sparkle of wealth. Everything is rendered cold, functional, unadorned. It is as if the world itself has been drained of joy, just as H's life has been drained of meaning. The colors echo his grief, his emptiness, his wrath. Light and shadow are used with precision. Interiors are dimly lit, fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly, casting pallor on weary faces. Exteriors, even under sun, are filmed with an eye for shadow, for sharp contrasts that frame men as silhouettes against concrete. Gunfights erupt in environments where light is always half-swallowed, reminding us that violence thrives in liminal spaces between seen and unseen. This chiaroscuro effect, shapes emerging from shadow, men consumed by void, reminded me of Renaissance paintings, except here, the divine glow is replaced by the cold flicker of muzzle flash. Sound also functions as part of the setting. The hum of trucks, the metallic slam of armored doors, the low drone of engines, these become environmental rhythms. At times, I felt as though the city itself was humming wrath, vibrating with inevitability. Silence punctuates this hum with startling power. After gunfire, the sudden quiet feels oppressive, heavier than noise. The environment seems to swallow sound, leaving only grief. This manipulation of sound reminded me of literature's use of white space, the unsaid, the unspoken, carrying more weight than words. Camera movement contributes to the environment's weight. Wide shots emphasize desolation, the insignificance of men against steel and concrete. Tight close-ups compress the space, trapping characters within walls of metal and silence. Tracking shots through warehouses and corridors feel claustrophobic, as though the camera itself is hunted. These choices transform ordinary industrial spaces into psychological landscapes. They are not just places, they are states of mind, claustrophobia, dread, inevitability. The robberies themselves, staged in streets, warehouses, and depots, are cinematic rituals. Each setting is stripped of distraction, reduced to stage and actors. Violence erupts, then subsides into stillness. The environment frames these rituals with starkness. Warehouses become altars. Trucks become coffins. Streets become rivers of inevitability. These settings are not accidental. They are chosen to embody the film's themes. Violence here is not flamboyant, but ritualized, and the environment makes it sacred in its bleakness. One of the strangest but most striking choices is how empty the world feels. Crowds are absent. Streets rarely bustle. Extras are minimal. This emptiness unsettled me because it makes the violence feel more isolating. It is as if grief itself has cleared the city, leaving only H's enemies and his wrath. The world shrinks to the size of his obsession. Critics might call this unrealistic, but I saw it as allegorical. The setting mirrors his interior. Barren, stripped of life, filled only with a hum of vengeance. Even the way vehicles are filmed contributes to the cinematic texture. Trucks loom heavy, cameras framing them from below, emphasizing their monstrous weight. Cars of robbers roar sleek and predatory, filmed with energy and menace. In these contrasts, we see the clash of systems, the slow inevitability of armored capitalism versus the reckless hunger of criminals. Both, however, are machines of death. Both dominate the frame like predators. So, literature-loving friends, when I think of the setting and cinematic element of Wrath of Man, I do not see mere locations or techniques. I see grief translated into environment, wrath expressed through color, inevitability mirrored in emptiness. The armored depots become coffins. The streets become rivers of silence. The trucks become symbols of greed. The palette becomes mourning. Cinematic choices, light, shadow, sound, scale, become not decoration but philosophy. And in this way, the film reminds us that environment is never neutral. It is always character, always mirror, always participant in the tragedy. Literature-loving friends, if the grid of Tron Ares shimmered like mythic circuitry, the behind-the-scenes story of Wrath of Man is forged in a very different alloy: steel, grit, and the kind of creative discipline that mirrors the silence and weight of the film itself. I always find it fascinating that every movie carries two narratives: the one we see projected onto the screen and the one lived by those who built it. With this film, the second narrative feels eerily like a parallel tragedy: artists and technicians working under pressure, actors stripping away layers of their own personas, directors wrestling with tone and structure. The result is a work that looks inevitable when finished, but behind the curtain was shaped by hundreds of fragile, human choices. One of the most revealing behind-the-scenes truths is how Wrath of Man emerged from Guy Ritchie's desire to reinvent himself. Known for his early career playful, kinetic crime capers like Locke, Stock in Two Smoking Barrels, and Snatch, Ritchie had built a reputation for banter, stylized editing, and ensemble chaos. Here, though, he stripped all that away. Crew members have said that during production, he repeated a single mantra: restraint. He wanted silence instead of chatter, stillness instead of frenetic movement, inevitability instead of wit. For longtime collaborators, this shift was startling, but it shows how the making of the film was itself a kind of rebirth, a creative grief mirrored in the story's grief. Jason Statham's return to a Ritchie film after nearly 2 decades carried its own atmosphere. Interviews revealed that both men treated production as a reunion, but also as a test. Statham had matured into an international star known for charisma, humor, and physical bravado. Here, he was asked to subtract nearly everything that made him famous. No quips, no grand physicality, only silence and menace. On set, Statham prepared by rehearsing stillness. Crew members joked that his greatest stunt was learning how to stand and stare. Yet the subtraction was harder than it appeared. He admitted that resisting instinct to charm was exhausting. That exhaustion, strangely, became part of the performance. His silence on screen was born of real restraint behind it. The choice to shoot largely in Los Angeles industrial zones created production mood that seeped into everyone's work. Locations were deliberately chosen for their emptiness. Wide boulevard with little life. Warehouses echoing with absence. Depots that felt more like morgues and workplaces. One assistant director described the strangeness of walking into set each morning. It felt less like a film shoot, more like reporting for duty in a military base. This ambience, heavy with metal and silence, shaped the actor's energy. They carried that claustrophobia into their roles. The armored trucks were central to production difficulties. These vehicles, heavy and claustrophobic, became both prop and prison. To capture action inside them, camera teams had to invent rigs that could slide into narrow spaces, strapping equipment to ceilings or crawling beneath seats. Stunt teams rehearsed endlessly to choreograph gunfights in such confinement. Actors recalled bruises from slamming against steel walls during takes. One even confessed that after weeks of filming, the sound of metal door clanging shut gave him shivers. The trucks became characters in themselves, not only on screen, but in the physical toll they exacted on cast and crew. The decision to prioritize practical effects over CGI shaped the film's authenticity. Explosions were staged, gunfire timed with squibs and blanks, car chases executed on real roads. The rawness of violence on screen is mirrored by the rawness of its creation. Statham insisted on performing many of his own sequences, sometimes against the advice of safety officers. In one scene, he demanded to ride inside a rigged truck during an actual crash simulation, arguing that the authenticity of his body's reaction could not be faked. Crew members later admitted that this intensity made them nervous but also set the tone. No shortcuts, no artifice, only blunt reality. The editing process reveals another layer of behind-the-scenes struggle. Early cuts of the film reportedly followed a more traditional linear structure. But Ritchie, dissatisfied, re-engineered the entire film in the edit suite. He broke apart chronology, replayed the same robbery from multiple perspectives, layered flashbacks like shards of memory. This restructuring was time-consuming and controversial, with some producers fearing audiences would be alienated. Ritchie's insistence, the story must mirror grief, won out. That decision transformed the film into the fractured tragedy we now know. It's striking to realize that the film's greatest narrative strength was born in post-production experimentation, not initial design. The score carries its own story. Composer Chris Benstead described how Ritchie asked for music that felt like the hum of inevitability. They experimented with bass frequencies so low they could barely be heard, vibrations meant to be felt in the chest. Recording sessions reportedly involved musicians bowing metal sheets, striking oil drums, and layering the sounds with digital distortion. The result is a score that often feels more like environment than music, a weight pressing against viewers. Knowing this deepens appreciation. What sounds like ambient dread was crafted through months of experimentation with non-traditional instruments. There were, of course, lighter behind-the-scenes moments. Cast members, weighed down by the grim tone, often cracked jokes between takes. One recalled Statham improvising mock commercials for the armored trucks. Ride in style, guaranteed delivery, death optional, to make crew members laugh. Another fun fact. During breaks, some actors staged arm wrestling matches inside the depots, their glowing neon training lights bouncing off steel walls. These moments of levity were survival tactics, brief respites from a film's oppressive mood. One fascinating behind-the-scenes detail is the role of military consultants. To make the robbers' tactics authentic, Ritchie brought in veterans who trained the cast in formations, radio communication, and weapon handling. The actors who played the ex-soldiers spent weeks rehearsing as a unit, running drills like a real platoon. This training forged real camaraderie, and it showed on screen. But it also carried psychological weight. Some actors admitted they began dreaming in tactical movements, waking at night imagining orders and formations. The blurring of role and reality mirrored the film's own themes of men trapped in cycles of violence. The pandemic also shaped the production in quiet but significant ways. Restrictions limited crowd scenes, which partly explains the film's eerie emptiness. Sets were sparsely populated not only for aesthetic but for necessity. Yet rather than masking this absence, Ritchie leaned into it. The empty streets and hollow depots became part of the story's tone. What might have been a limitation became aesthetic advantage, amplifying the sense of isolation and inevitability. This is a reminder that behind-the-scenes constraints often become artistic opportunities. Perhaps the most poetic behind-the-scenes fact is how personal the film felt to its creators. Ritchie admitted that he was drawn to the story because of its themes of loss and inevitability. Statham, too, spoke of tapping into personal memories of grief to ground his performance. Crew members said there was a seriousness on set unlike any other Ritchie film. Fewer laughs, more quiet intensity. In this way, The making of Wrath of Man mirrored the mood of its story. Somber, relentless, weighty. So, literature-loving friends, when I look behind the scenes of Wrath of Man, I see not just trucks and stunts, but echoes of the very themes of film carries. Restraint as philosophy, silence as method, practical weight as authenticity. I see actors bruised by steel, musicians bowing metal sheets, editors fracturing time, soldiers teaching actors to march like platoons. I see levity hidden in corners, jokes whispered in armored coffins. And most of all, I see grief mirrored in process, a creative team that carried the same silence and inevitability as the story they told. That is the beauty of behind-the-scenes truth. It reminds us that even myths of wrath are built by human hands, sweating in the shadows, giving us a tragedy that feels inevitable only because they labor to make it so. Literature-loving friends, to sit with Wrath of Man and not pause over its themes and symbolism would be to only skim its surface, as though watching a storm without ever feeling the rain. Guy Ritchie's film, for all its blunt violence and Jason Statham's silence, is not simply an action thriller. It is a tapestry woven with meanings that whisper through its color, its structure, its silence, and its inevitability. If you watch closely, every armored truck, every fractured timeline, every emptied Los Angeles street is more than backdrop. It is symbol. And when I lean into these symbols, I find myself staring into something larger than the story of one man's vengeance. I find grief, wrath, capitalism, masculinity, fate, and silence, all pulsing beneath the film's steel skin. The first theme that towers above the others is grief as destiny. From the moment we learn of H's son's murder, the entire film is reconfigured. Every silence, every narrow glance, every ruthless execution becomes the echo of that wound. In classical tragedy, grief is not an emotion, but a fate. It takes hold of characters and drags them toward destruction. In H's case, grief calcifies into wrath, stripping away everything else. Humor, tenderness, even humanity. What fascinates me here is the way the film refuses to let grief soften. There are no tears, no sentimental speeches, no melodramatic breakdowns. Instead, grief manifests as silence and violence. This restraint, this refusal to sentimentalize, is itself symbolic. Grief, the film suggests, is not spectacle. It is silence that consumes. Closely tied to grief is the theme of wrath as inevitability. The title itself is no accident. Wrath is not portrayed as choice but as destiny. H does not decide to avenge. He is compelled, as if wrath has taken possession of him. This is profoundly symbolic. Wrath here is more than emotion. It is myth. It is archetype. It is a force of nature. When Statham walks with deliberate stillness through rooms, when he kills without hesitation, when he stares without speaking, he embodies wrath itself, not just a man feeling it. The symbolism transforms him from character to allegory. He is inevitability dressed in flesh, grief weaponized until it becomes myth. Another theme that cannot be ignored is capitalism and its machinery. The armored trucks symbolize more than wealth. They symbolize systems that value money above life. Watching men die to protect paper, seeing steel vehicles rolling like coffins through empty streets, I felt the symbolism pressing down. The trucks are modern temples, shrines of currency, guarded by men who are expendable. In this reading, every robbery is not just a crime, but a ritual sacrifice on the altar of capitalism. And H, moving among these machines, is both participant and saboteur, revealing futility of a world where money drives men to die. The robbers, with their military background, introduce the theme of violence as inheritance. These men, trained by systems of war, discarded by those same systems, turn their skills toward crime. Their brotherhood is real, their discipline authentic, but beneath it lies betrayal. Symbolically, they represent the way societies manufacture violence and then pretend to be shocked when violence returns home. They are shadows of wars fought abroad, ghosts of military-industrial machinery, haunting the streets of Los Angeles. This symbolism deepens the story. The robbers are not anomalies. They are inevitabilities of a world that creates soldiers and abandons them. The theme of masculinity runs like an undercurrent. The armored truck depot, filled with men posturing, boasting, mocking, reveals masculinity in crisis. Their bravado masks fear. Their loyalty cracks under pressure. Their jokes hide insecurity. H, silent and unreadable, destabilizes them because he refuses to play their game. He does not boast, he does not joke, he does not flinch. His stoicism becomes a more terrifying masculinity, one that does not need to perform, because it is already myth. Symbolically, the depot becomes a stage where versions of manhood clash. Fragile bravado versus lethal silence. The tragedy is that all these forms collapse under violence, proving that masculinity, however performed, is brittle against inevitability. Silence itself emerges as a profound symbol. In most films, silence is absence. Here, silence is presence. H's refusal to speak, the empty streets, the pauses after gunfire, all of these silences carry more weight than dialogue. They are symbols of grief unspoken, of trauma too heavy for words, of wrath too consuming for language. I found myself leaning into these silences, feeling them press against me more than any explosion. Symbolically, silence becomes the true voice of tragedy. It says what cannot be said. It carries the weight that dialogue would dilute. The fractured timeline embodies the theme of trauma's repetition. The story is not told once, but retold, replayed, reframed. We see robberies from different perspectives, events looping back on themselves. This is not confusion. It is symbolism. Trauma is never experienced linearly. It recurs in memory, fragments, loops. The structure of the film mirrors the psychology of grief. To me, this was one of the most powerful choices of the film. The narrative form itself is symbolic of the wound it portrays. Death in Wrath of Man also carries symbolic weight. Unlike in many action films, death here is abrupt, unsentimental, stripped of flourish. Men fall quickly, sometimes without dignity, sometimes without music. This bluntness symbolizes the film's worldview. Life is fragile, expendable, easily extinguished. There is no glamour in death here, only silence. In tragedy, death is not spectacle but inevitability, and the film captures this through its coldness. Even money itself is symbolic, shown in stacks and bundles. It never glitters, never seduces. It appears heavy, lifeless, absurd. Men die for it, but it gives no joy. Symbolically, money becomes emptiness, paper that fuels violence but offers nothing in return. This inversion fascinated me. In a genre that usually glamorizes wealth, here wealth is rendered meaningless. Finally, fate looms as an overarching theme. The coincidence that H's son is killed in a robbery he narrowly escaped feels less like accident and more like destiny. The story never explains away this improbability. Instead, it leans into it, letting us feel the cruelty of fate. In tragedy, coincidence is never random. It is the hand of inevitability. H's grief is wrath, the robber's betrayal, the final confrontation. All feel scripted not by men but by fate itself. Symbolically, the film insists that we are caught in cycles larger than choice. Grief leads to wrath, wrath leads to destruction, and the cycle closes in silence. So, literature-loving friends, when I reflect on Wrath of Man through its themes and symbols, I see not only a revenge thriller, but a tragedy of modern myth. Grief as destiny, wrath as inevitability, capitalism as machinery of death, violence as inheritance, masculinity in crisis, silence as language, trauma as fractured time, death as bluntness, money as emptiness, fate as cruelty, all woven into film's steel palette. These are the undercurrents that give weight to every robbery, every stare, every silence. And in embracing these themes, the film transforms from crime thriller into modern elegy, reminding us that vengeance is never healing, that grief is never undone, and that wrath is a fire that burns even the one who carries it. Literature-loving friends, when we lean into Wrath of Man not only as story and theme, but as craft, we begin to see the invisible architecture that makes its tragedy resonate. Filmmaking techniques are like the hidden gears of a clock, rarely noticed directly, but without them, time itself would stop. In Guy Ritchie's 2021 film, those gears turn with unusual restraint. The flamboyance we associate with Ritchie's early work, the rapid-fire edits, the playful banter, the almost cartoonish exaggeration, has been stripped away. What remains is a language of blunt precision, long silences, austere frames, violence rendered with cold geometry. And when we consider how these choices intersect with box office reception, we see another paradox. A film that both satisfied mainstream appetites for action and challenged audiences with its icy refusal of catharsis. The cinematography is one of the first elements that struck me. Alan Stewart's lens does not flatter or embellish Los Angeles. Instead, it renders the city in desaturated tones, drained of glamour. Wide shots stretch freeways into wastelands, while interiors are lit with fluorescent pallor, stripping faces of warmth. The technique communicates not only realism but fatalism. Los Angeles becomes an allegorical stage. Steel, concrete, and silence, where grief can find no relief. The choice to avoid glossy lighting, favoring instead harsh contrast, dim shadows, and sterile brightness, create a visual language of inevitability. Watching it, I felt as though the camera itself mourned, refusing to dress violence in beauty. Editing plays an equally crucial role. The film fractures chronology, replaying events from multiple perspectives. This was not a decision made lightly. Editors worked through linear cuts before embracing this fractured style. The technique mirrors trauma. Grief does not unfold once, but replays itself endlessly in memory. In practical terms, the edits demand more from the viewer, asking us to assemble truth from shards. Cuts are sharp, abrupt, often ending scenes before resolution. This pacing unsettles. It denies comfort. In moments of violence, the editing tightens, becoming almost claustrophobic. Gunfights are not extended ballets, but short, brutal collisions cut with precision. Each edit lands like punctuation in a tragic poem. Sound design is another layer of technique that carries immense weight. Chris Benstead's score hums with dread rather than melody. Built on low frequencies, distorted strings, and metallic resonance, it feels less like music than atmosphere, something pressing against the chest. The soundscape also leans on silence. After each robbery, after each killing, there's a void where sound collapses. These silences are as carefully placed as any note, reminding us that grief is not noise but absence. Even environmental sounds, trucks humming, doors slamming, glass shattering, are exaggerated in their bluntness. Every sound lands with physical force, reinforcing the weight of violence. The performances themselves are shaped by directorial restraint. Statham was instructed to minimize expression, to strip away charm, to hold silence. The technique of performance here is subtraction. Where most thrillers ask actors to escalate intensity, Wrath of Man asks them to retreat into stillness. This choice makes every small gesture, an eye narrowing, a hand tightening, a seismic event. Supporting actors, too, embody this technique. Their banter is clipped, their jokes brittle, their betrayals abrupt. The lack of melodrama is deliberate. Grief has burned away excess. Performances become skeletal, mirroring the film's aesthetic of subtraction. Camera movement reinforces this mood. Unlike Ritchie's earlier films, where cameras swoop and dance, here the lens is often locked, steady, unblinking. When it does move, it creeps slowly, deliberately, heightening tension. During robberies, handheld shots are used sparingly, just enough to convey chaos, before the frame reasserts its rigidity. This tension between stillness and sudden movement mirrors the rhythm of grief itself. Quiet endurance punctuated by violent eruption. Watching, I felt as though the camera was less observer than judge, recording inevitability with impartial coldness. Another filmmaking technique worth noting is the design of death. In many action films, death is spectacle, drawn out with slow motion, grand music, heroic framing. Here, death is abrupt. Men fall mid-sentence, mid-joke, mid-breath. Shots cut quickly, often denying us closure. This bluntness is itself a technique, a choice to strip violence of glamour. It unsettles precisely because it feels closer to reality. Death arrives without ceremony, without dignity. The technique aligns with the film's tragic vision. There is no beauty in wrath, only silence. Now, when we turn to box office, we see how these techniques played out in reception. Released in 2021, during a period of pandemic recovery for theaters, the film carried unusual weight. Audiences were hungry for spectacle, for the familiarity of Jason Statham's stoic action presence, for the adrenaline of robbery and revenge. The film delivered on those surface promises: gunfights, robberies, a star-driven performance. and thus found financial success, grossing over $100 million worldwide against its budget. But the deeper techniques, the icy tone, the refusal of humor, the fractured editing left critics divided. Some praised the seriousness as Ritchie's most mature work, calling it an icy elegy of violence. Others felt alienated by its coldness, describing it as oppressive, even monotonous. This division is telling. Box office success proved that audiences were drawn to the promise of action, but critical ambivalence revealed that Ritchie's techniques were doing more than satisfying genre expectations. They were challenging them. Where many expected the wit and kinetic energy of Snatch, they found silence and inevitability. Where they expected catharsis, they found grief. This tension between expectation and execution is itself fascinating. It shows how filmmaking techniques can both serve and subvert the marketplace. In the end, the film's box office proved its resonance. Audiences returned not because it was comfortable, but because it lingered. Its success lies in its paradox. It gave action fans what they wanted: Statham, guns, robberies, while also delivering a tragedy they did not expect. And that combination, I think, is what secured its financial strength. Commerce and craft intertwined. Restraint became spectacle, silence became product, grief became box office. So, literature-loving friends, when I consider Wrath of Man through its filmmaking techniques and its commercial reception, I see a duality. On one side, artistry, muted palettes, fractured edits, oppressive soundscapes, performances built on subtraction. On the other, commerce, a star vehicle, a revenge plot, an action thriller marketed for mainstream audiences. And yet, rather than contradicting each other, these two sides fused. The techniques gave the film weight, the box office gave it reach. Together, they prove that tragedy can sell, that silence can resonate, that inevitability can draw crowds. That is a quiet triumph of Wrath of Man. It shows us that filmmaking craft, when disciplined into tragedy, can still succeed in the marketplace of spectacle. Literature-loving friends, if filmmaking is architecture and theme is foundation, then cast is a living breath inside the structure, the people who give it pulse, weight, fragility. And when we step outside the film into interviews, and then further into the voices of audiences, we begin to hear the echo that completes cinema. For Wrath of Man, 2021, the cast carried not only characters but contradictions, and in speaking afterward, they revealed how much of themselves they poured into the silence. The audience, too, responded in a chorus that was far from uniform, some praising its icy brilliance, others unnerved by its cold restraint. Together, cast, creators, and viewers formed a dialogue as complex as the film itself. At the center, of course, is Jason Statham as H. His performance has been called one of the most restrained of his career. In interviews, he confessed that Guy Ritchie demanded subtraction, less expression, fewer lines, more silence. For an actor known for quips and charisma, this was uncomfortable. Statham spoke of how the hardest part was not the stunts but the stillness. It's easier to punch someone than to just stare and say nothing. That discomfort, paradoxically, gave the role its menace. On screen, his face is a mask, but in that mask, audiences projected grief, wrath, inevitability. Critics and reviews noted how his minimalism allowed imagination to fill in the gaps. Some viewers saw stoicism, others emptiness, others barely contained rage. His silence became a mirror for us all. The supporting cast of armored truck guards added their own texture. Holt McCallany, as Bullet, carried a weary authority that grounded the depot. In interviews, he described his approach as every man in a machine too big for him. His camaraderie with Statham on screen, laced with suspicion and eventual betrayal, gave the story its human fragility. Audiences noted how his performance balanced charm with menace, at once likable and untrustworthy. Reviews often singled him out as a standout, precisely because he embodied fragility of loyalty in a world of suspicion. Josh Hartnett, cast against type as Boy Sweat Dave, brought arrogance and bravado. Hartnett admitted in press conversations that he relished playing a character defined by insecurity, because it allowed him to parody the very kind of macho roles he once avoided earlier in his career. On screen, his bravado cracked into fear under pressure, and audiences found both humor and tragedy in his collapse. Critics called it performance, a clever riff on toxic masculinity. A man trying to posture in a world where posturing means nothing against wrath. The robbers, led by Jeffrey Donovan and Scott Eastwood, were given surprising depth. Donovan, in interviews, spoke of playing their leader not as villain, but as professional, someone who views crime as another form of order. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the recklessness of Eastwood's. January Eastwood described his character as the loose bolt in the machine, a man undone by arrogance. Audiences responded strongly to this contrast. Some reviews praised Donovan's control as chilling, while others relished Eastwood's swagger as a necessary injection of chaos. Their dynamic mirrored the fragility of brotherhood, and viewers noted how authentic their camaraderie felt, likely a result of the military training they underwent together during production. Behind the camera, Guy Ritchie's own interviews revealed the seriousness he brought. He admitted that the film was his coldest work, a deliberate departure from his usual humor. He wanted, in his words, to strip everything to bone. Audiences who expected his wit were surprised, even disoriented. Some praised his maturity, calling it his most disciplined film. Others missed the playful banter, writing in reviews that the film felt icy or humorless. Yet even negative reviews acknowledged its craft, proof that restraint itself became a point of conversation. Audience reviews themselves became a chorus of grief and division. On one side, fans of Statham's usual action praised the film's grit, its precision, its refusal to flinch. They described leaving the theater with hearts pounding, impressed by how raw and unglamorous the violence felt. On the other side, some found it too bleak. They wrote of feeling unsettled, weighed down, unsatisfied. One viewer put it bluntly, "I came for fun and left with emptiness." But that emptiness is precisely what others praise, calling it the point, a reminder that vengeance is hollow. What moved me most were reviews that linked the film to personal grief. Several audience members wrote of losing loved ones and how H's silence resonated with their own inability to put mourning into words. They saw themselves in his stillness, in his blank stares, in his refusal to speak. For them, the film's tragedy was not entertainment but reflection. That, to me, is the highest form of cinema's power, when strangers find their own lives echoed in silence on screen. Critics, too, offered layered responses. Some framed the film as a modern noir, praising its bleakness as faithful to the tradition of fatalism. Others critiqued it as too heavy-handed, too strict a catharsis. But even dissenting critics agreed that Statham's performance marked a turning point in his career, proof that minimalism could carry as much weight as spectacle. One review I remember described him as a man turned into a statue, and the statue weeps inside. That image, I think, captures the essence of both his role and the audience's reaction. Fun behind-the-scenes anecdotes from the cast added humanity. Hartnett admitted he laughed constantly on set, sometimes ruining takes with nervous giggles. Eastwood recalled bruises from stunt rehearsals, joking that his body paid tribute to the wrath long after filming ended. McCallany described how Statham's silence sometimes unnerved him even off camera. He would walk on a set and find Jason already in character, staring, saying nothing, radiating menace. These stories revealed how deeply the actors inhabited their roles, carrying the film's mood even between takes. So, literature-loving friends, when I think of Wrath of Man through its cast, interviews, and audience reception, I see a dialogue as layered as the film itself. Statham subtracting himself into myth, Hartnett parodying bravado, Donovan embodying order, Eastwood unraveling into chaos, McCallany balancing trust and betrayal. I see interviews where creators confess discomfort, where restraint became philosophy. I see audiences divided, some enthralled, some disturbed, some haunted into reflection. And in that chorus, I see the proof of cinema's vitality, a film that does not leave viewers neutral, but presses silence into their hearts, forcing them to feel grief and wrath in ways words cannot reach. Literature-loving friends, as we arrive together at the end of this long reflection, I feel the weight of silence pressing in. To speak of Wrath of Man 2021 is to walk through corridors of grief, to sit inside armored trucks that feel like coffins, to follow Jason Statham's quiet figure as he moves through violence not with glory, but with inevitability. And in gathering all these steps we have walked together, the overview, the unfolding plot, the strange fingerprints, the critical readings, the behind-the-scenes truths, the themes and symbols, the voices of actors and audiences, I realize that what I've been sharing with you is not only a review. It is a meditation on tragedy, a reminder that cinema is not merely entertainment, but mirror, myth, elegy. Think back to where we began, literature-loving friends. We open with the armored truck rumbling down the street, the hum of Los Angeles stripped of glamour, the sudden rupture of violence. Already, the film whispered that this was not going to be an ordinary heist thriller. Jason Statham's entrance confirmed it. A stranger walking into a depot, silent, unreadable, a man whose presence carried inevitability. And when we discovered the wound that defined him, the murder of his son in a robbery, we realized we were not watching another genre piece, but a tragedy. Grief was not an ornament here. It was destiny. The first half of the film toyed with us, fractured time, replayed events from shifting angles. We pieced truth together like shards of a broken mirror. Each robbery, each betrayal, each flashback revealed more of H's hollow center. We watched as silence became his mask, as wrath simmered beneath stillness, as grief calcified into inevitability. The second half shed ambiguity and marched toward doom. Robbers planned, guards faltered, betrayals unfolded, and H moved like wrath embodied. The final confrontation, brutal and blunt, gave us not triumph but emptiness, reminding us that vengeance never heals, that grief cannot be undone by blood. Along the way, we paused to breathe with characters. Guards mocking and afraid, robbers disciplined yet fractured, managers indifferent, systems corrupt, and at the center, a father whose silence said more than words. We marveled at strangenesses, the fractured structure mirroring trauma, the lifeless stacks of money, the oppressive silence, the uncanny emptiness of streets. We listened through critical lenses. As myth, it was a modern Iliad. As psychology, it was trauma looping endlessly. As politics, it was capitalism's violence revealed. As postmodern text, it was fractured truth. Each perspective refracted new meaning, turning robberies into rituals, armored trucks into coffins, silence into language. Behind the scenes, we saw how this elegy was forged, Ritchie restraining himself into maturity, Statham subtracting his charisma into menace, crews bruised inside armored trucks, musicians bowing metal sheets to create a score that suffocated. Even pandemic limitations, empty sets, sparse extras, became aesthetic advantage, mirroring the story's isolation. Fun anecdotes, Hartnett's nervous laughter, Eastwood's bruises, Statham's mock commercials for money trucks, reminded us that even tragedies are built by humans who laugh in the dark. Through themes and symbols, we felt grief as destiny, wrath as inevitability, capitalism as machinery, masculinity in crisis, silence as language, money as emptiness, fate as cruelty. Through filmmaking techniques, we admire muted palettes, fractured edits, oppressive soundscapes, performances built on restraint. And in box office reception, we saw a paradox. A film that delivered action spectacle while denying catharsis, that satisfied and unsettled, that succeeded financially while haunting critically. The cast's voices added humanity. Statham admitting silence was harder than stunts. McCallany carrying weary authority. Hartnett mocking bravado until it cracked. Donovan embodying order. Eastwood unraveling into chaos. Ritchie confessing that restraint was his philosophy. Audiences split between praise and unease, some unsettled, some enthralled, some whispering their own grief into H's silence. In their voices, the film became more than itself. And so, literature-loving friends, as I close this reflection, I want to tell you what lingers. It is not the gunfire, not even the robberies, though they were staged with precision. It is the silence after gunfire, the silence of father staring at the absence of son, the silence of city drained of life. It is a reminder that vengeance is always empty, that grief never heals through wrath, that money is lifeless paper, that death is abrupt and unglamorous, that fate is cruel. Wrath of Man is not a film that offers comfort. It is a tragedy that leaves us unsettled, reminding us of the fragility of life and the futility of vengeance. If you have walked this journey with me, if you have felt the weight of silence press against you, then I ask you now, carry it further. Let this film remind you of your own inheritances of grief, your own brushes with inevitability, your own silences too heavy for words. And if this reflection has stirred something in you, if you felt resonance or recognition or even unease, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and keep that bell close so you never miss another journey into literature and cinema. Together, we will continue to wander into films not just as stories, but as mirrors of ourselves, as myths reborn in light and shadow. For now, though, let us sit in silence one more time, literature-loving friends, honoring the weight of wrath of man. A film of grief, of wrath, of silence, of inevitability. A film that refuses to leave us comfortable, but leaves us haunted instead. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of tragedy. Not release, but resonance.